While I was abroad, my parents allowed my brother to move into my apartment. Now they're upset that I want him out. I had been traveling for nearly a year, combining work with some adventure, and had sublet my apartment to a friend while I was gone. My plan was simple: come back, settle in, and enjoy the peace of having my own space again. After hours on a plane, all I wanted was to drop my bags, collapse on the couch, and maybe order some takeout. Instead, I walked into what felt like an alternate reality. The first clue something was wrong was the sneakers in the hallway, beat up and far too big to be mine. Then I saw the living room. My bookshelves were crammed with unfamiliar items. A gaming console I didn't own was hooked up to my TV, and the coffee table was cluttered with half-empty soda cans and what might have once been nachos before they hardened into something unrecognizable. "Yo, you're back!" Mason's voice boomed from the kitchen, and my younger brother strolled out like he owned the place. "What's going on? What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to stay calm despite the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Oh, yeah? Mom and Dad didn't tell you? I'm crashing here for a bit, just temporary, he replied casually. Temporary? No one told me about this. I dropped my bags and stared at him. You're kidding, right? This is my apartment. Mason shrugged nonchalantly. Yeah, but you've been gone forever. Mom and Dad said it was fine. I didn't think you'd care. My blood pressure spiked. You didn't think I'd care that you moved into my apartment without asking? How long is temporary exactly? He avoided eye contact, scratching the back of his neck. Not sure yet. I got laid off a while ago, so, just until I figure things out. That's when my anger really hit me. Not only had he invaded my space, but my parents had apparently signed off on it without even consulting me, as if my opinion didn't matter. I pulled out my phone and called my mom. She answered after a couple of rings. "Ryan, welcome home, honey. How was your flight?" she asked warmly. Mom? I began, struggling to keep my tone steady. Did you know Mason is living in my apartment? She hesitated. Well, yes. We thought it would be fine. You were away, and he needed somewhere to stay. It's just temporary. No one asked me, I snapped. Don't be so dramatic, honey. He's your brother. Families help each other. Since when does helping mean ignoring boundaries? I retorted before hanging up to avoid saying something I'd regret. Turning back to Mason, I said firmly, "You need to leave. Today." He looked genuinely offended. "Dude, where am I supposed to go?" "Not my problem," I replied, but Mason didn't budge. Instead, he made himself a sandwich and flopped onto the couch like he owned it. I was at a loss. I couldn't physically throw him out, but I also couldn't tolerate this invasion of my space. That night, lying in the bed I hadn't slept in for a year, I could hear Mason's video games blaring from the living room. The whole situation felt surreal. This was not the homecoming I had imagined. I couldn't fathom how my parents thought this was acceptable. Mason had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and I had spent most of my life cleaning up his messes. But this was a new level of entitlement. The next morning I'd tried reasoning with him again, hoping he'd come to his senses. "Seriously, Mason, when are you leaving?" Without even pausing his game, he said, "I don't know, man. Mom and Dad said you'd be cool with it." "I'm not," I shot back. "Well, it's not like you're here all the time anyway," he retorted, his audacity leaving me speechless. I spent the day alternating between arguing with Mason, calling my parents to plead my case, and venting to my girlfriend Ella. Over the phone, she was empathetic, but practical. "Maybe he really doesn't have anywhere else to go," she suggested. "You should talk to your parents again and try to work out a timeline." "A timeline?" I muttered. "He shouldn't even be here." Well, you can't just throw him out onto the street, she reasoned. I hated that she was right. As much as I wanted to toss his stuff out the window, I knew I couldn't. Yet every hour that passed made it clear Mason had no plans to leave any time soon. By evening, my frustration boiled over. I called my dad, hoping he'd be more reasonable than my mom. "Ryan," he answered in his typical no-nonsense tone. "Dad, Mason needs help, and I need my space. This is my apartment. Why didn't anyone ask me?" "Because we knew you'd say no," he replied bluntly. I was stunned. They had known I'd refuse, and went ahead with it anyway. Speechless, I ended the call and paced the apartment, fuming. Mason had trashed my place, disrupted my life, and my own parents didn't think I had the right to be upset. The worst part was that this wasn't a problem I could fix in a day. Mason wasn't going anywhere, and my family was backing him. The following days were filled with tension, arguments, and passive-aggressive exchanges. Mason remained glued to my couch, acting as if it were his throne. My once peaceful sanctuary now felt like a prison I shared with a disrespectful, flea-loading roommate. Attempts to reason with him were met with indifference or flimsy excuses. "I'm looking for jobs," he'd say, scrolling on his phone. Or, "I've got nowhere else to go," as he sprawled out, scattering crumbs across the cushions. Every night, I called Ella to vent. "This is insane. He's not even pretending to find another place." "I know it's frustrating, Ryan," she sighed, "but have you spoken to your parents in person? Maybe they need to see how much this is affecting you." "They don't care. They've always babied him," I snapped, pacing the kitchen. "Then prove you're serious. Get everyone in the same room and lay down some boundaries," she suggested. She had a point. Phone calls weren't working, and if I didn't take a firmer stance, this temporary arrangement could turn into something permanent. Reluctantly, I called my mom and requested a family meeting. She sounded hesitant, but agreed. A few nights later, I arrived at my parents' house, the air thick with tension. My mom greeted me with a nervous smile, while my dad wore his usual stern expression. Mason, of course, was already there, slouched in a chair and scrolling on his phone, as if he had better things to do. "Ryan," my mom said, ushering me in, "why don't you sit down? I made coffee." "I didn't want coffee. I wanted answers. We need to talk about Mason staying in my apartment." My dad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What's there to talk about? He's family. You're supposed to help each other out." I bristled at the word supposed. Help? He's taken over my apartment without permission, and isn't even trying to find another place. This isn't helping, it's enabling. Mason let out a scoffing laugh. "Calm down, dude. It's not like I've trashed the place." "Really? Have you looked at the living room? You've turned it into a dump," I fired back. "That's enough, Ryan," my mom cut in, her voice calm but firm. "Mason's going through a rough patch right now. He lost his job and rent is expensive. We thought you'd understand." "I might have understood if someone had asked me," I shot back. "Instead, you all decided it was fine for him to move in, like my opinion didn't matter." A heavy silence fell over the room. My mom glanced at my dad, who cleared his throat. "Ryan, you weren't even here. What were we supposed to do? Let him be homeless?" "Could have stayed here with you," I replied, gesturing around their spacious home. "Why didn't he move back in here?" Mason finally looked up from his phone. "Because I need to be in the city to find work, genius." I glared at him. "Do you even have a plan? A timeline? Or are you planning to squat in my apartment forever?" "I'm figuring it out," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. "That's not good enough," I said, turning back to my parents. "If this is temporary, then I want a deadline. 2 weeks. That's more than enough time to find another solution." My mom looked distressed. "Ryan, Be reasonable. No, Mom, I've been reasonable my whole life. This is my apartment, and I'm done being walked all over. She opened her mouth to argue, but my dad held up a hand. Fine. 2 weeks, he said gruffly, surprising everyone. Mason's head snapped up. What? You heard him, my dad said firmly. You've got 2 weeks to sort it out. I could hardly believe it. For once, my dad was on my side. Mason, however, looked like he'd just been betrayed. Unbelievable, he muttered, grabbing his phone and stomping out of the room. My mom sighed, rubbing her temples. Ryan, was this really necessary? Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm not the bad guy for wanting my space back. She didn't respond, and the silence felt suffocating. Part of me felt guilty. She obviously wanted to help Mason. But another part was relieved. For the first time in days, it felt like I had regained some control. The next morning, I received a text from Mason. You didn't have to ambush me like that. Thanks for making me feel like crap. I didn't bother replying. I wasn't interested in coddling him or reigniting the argument. Later that day, Ella called, her voice unusually hesitant. Hey, I just got a strange DM from Mason. What? I asked, my stomach tightening. Why is he messaging you? Says he feels like you're unfairly targeting him and wants me to talk to you. He thinks you're blowing things out of proportion. I groaned. Seriously? Now he's trying to turn you against me. I'm not taking his side if that's what you're worried about, she said quickly. But maybe you should keep an eye on him. He seems off. Off how? I pressed. I don't know, he just seems desperate. Be careful, okay? Ella's unease left me unsettled. Mason had always been impulsive and immature, but this felt different. There was an undertone I couldn't quite identify, something darker. That evening, as I was taking out the trash, I ran into Grace, my neighbor. She was friendly, though a bit too curious at times, and seemed eager to chat. So your brother's been staying with you, huh? She asked casually. Yeah, I muttered, not in the mood to explain. She tilted her head. He's been pretty busy, lots of people coming and going. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Oh, he's had some friends over, late nights, loud music, that kind of thing. My stomach sank. When? A few times over the last couple of weeks. I figured you knew. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. Not only had Mason taken over my apartment, but he was treating it like his personal party pad while I was gone, and I had no idea who these friends were or what they were doing. Thanks for letting me know, I said tightly before heading back upstairs. As soon as I walked through the door, I confronted Mason. What's this about you having people over? He blinked, feigning innocence. What are you talking about? Grace told me. Late nights, loud music. My neighbor shouldn't know more about what's happening in my apartment than I do. He scowled. Oh, so she's spying on me now? Great. Mason, I'm serious. What's going on? Nothing, he snapped. I had a couple of friends over. Big deal. It is a big deal. This is my home, not your hangout spot. If you do it again, you're out before your 2 weeks are up. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, seething. I'd hoped the family meeting would be a turning point, but it was clear Mason wasn't taking anything seriously. The clock was ticking on his 2 weeks, and I had a sinking feeling this wasn't going to end smoothly. The days dragged on, each one more frustrating than the last. Mason retreated into full sulking mode, barely speaking to me unless it was to complain about something. His 2-week deadline loomed, but there was no indication he was making any effort to leave. Every time I brought it up, he'd roll his eyes or mutter, "I'm working on it." If working on it meant sitting on my couch and leveling up in some RPG, then he was excelling. The breaking point came when Grace knocked on my door. One evening, Grace approached me, her face a mix of worry and hesitation. "Ryan, I wasn't sure if I should bring this up, but, She trailed off, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I saw your brother meeting some people in the parking lot. It looked, sketchy." "Sketchy how?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. She hesitated before leaning in closer. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it seemed like they were exchanging something. Maybe money. I didn't get a clear look, but it made me uneasy." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Grace wasn't the type to stir up trouble without reason, and her tone made it clear she was genuinely concerned. My gut told me this wasn't just Mason being immature. Something more serious was going on. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, my mind already racing. That night, after Mason went to bed, I decided to do some investigating. I quietly checked the spare room where he had dumped his belongings. Most of it was just clothes and random junk, but buried under a pile of hoodies I found a small locked metal box. It was compact but heavy, and the fact that it was locked immediately raised my suspicions. I stared at it, conflicted. Part of me felt that opening it would cross a line, but the other part, the part tired of Mason's lies, knew I needed to uncover what he was hiding. After a quick online search, I managed to pick the lock with a paper clip. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The box contained stacks of cash, rolled and secured with rubber bands. Thousands of dollars, by my guess. Beneath the cash was a small plastic bag holding what looked like pills. My hands trembled as I stared at the contents, struggling to make sense of it. Was Mason dealing drugs? Is that what he had been doing while I was away? I quickly put everything back, locked the box, and shoved it back where I'd found it. My mind raced. This wasn't just about him freeloading anymore. If Mason was involved in something illegal, it could blow back on me, especially since he was using my apartment as his base of operations. The next morning I confronted him. "We need to talk," I said, cornering him in the kitchen. He glanced up from his cereal, looking bored. "About what?" "The box in your room," I replied. His spoon froze mid-air. "What box?" "You know exactly which one, the one with cash and pills." His face turned pale, and for a moment he looked genuinely scared. Then his usual bravado returned. "You went through my stuff? That's messed up, man." "What's messed up," I snapped, "is you bringing drugs into my apartment. Do you have any idea how much trouble I could get in if someone found that here?" "It's not what you think," he said quickly, but his voice lacked confidence. "Then explain," I demanded, "because from where I'm standing it looks like you're dealing." "I'm not dealing," he shouted, his voice rising. "I'm just holding it for a friend." I let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even hear how ridiculous that sounds? Who's this friend, and why would they trust you with thousands of dollars and drugs?" He didn't answer, instead staring at the floor like a guilty child caught stealing cookies. "That's what I thought," I said coldly. "You have until the end of the week to get out, Mason. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here another day." "Ryan, come on." "No, we're done." That night I called Ella and told her everything. She was horrified but not entirely surprised. "Mason's always been reckless," she said, "but this is on another level." "What am I supposed to do?" I asked, pacing the living room. "If he's mixed up in something illegal, it could drag me down too." "Maybe you should talk to someone, like the police," she suggested hesitantly. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "I can't. He's still my brother. As much as I want him out of my life, I don't want to ruin it." "Then you need to set boundaries and stick to them," she said firmly. "No more second chances." She was right. Mason had crossed too many lines, and I couldn't keep enabling him, but part of me still felt conflicted. He was family, and as angry as I was, I didn't want to abandon him completely. A few days later, something unexpected happened. While I was sitting in the living room, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Harper, Mason's ex-girlfriend, stood there, looking both angry and desperate. "We need to talk," she said, brushing past me into the apartment. I blinked, stunned. "Harper, what are you doing here?" "I've been trying to get a hold of Mason, but he's ignoring me," she said sharply. "Do you even know what he's gotten himself into?" "Dinna bone opinion," I replied, crossing my arms. She hesitated, then sighed. "He owes a lot of money to some really dangerous people. That's probably why he's been acting so sketchy. If he doesn't pay them back soon, they're gonna come after him, and anyone close to him." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, anyone close to him?" She gave me a pointed look. I mean you. They know he's staying here, Ryan. If they can't get to him, they'll come after you instead." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about Mason's irresponsibility anymore. It was dangerous. "Were you telling me this?" I asked tightly. "Because despite everything, I don't want to see anyone get hurt," she said. "Mason may be a screw-up, but he's not a bad person. He's just in way over his head." "Yeah, well, he's dragging me down with him," I muttered. "Then you need to do something about it," she said seriously, "because if you don't, this isn't going to end well for either of you." Her words echoed in my mind after she left. I knew she was right. Something had to change. But how far was I willing to go to protect myself and my brother? The hours after Harper's visit were a blur of panic and anger. I thought things with Mason were bad before, but now it felt like I was living inside a ticking time bomb. If what Harper said was true, and I had no reason to doubt her, it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. I realized I was at risk simply by letting Mason stay under my roof. My irritation with his freeloading suddenly seemed minor compared to the fear gnawing at my insides. When Mason returned that evening, I didn't hesitate. The moment he walked through the door, I confronted him. "We need to talk, now." He froze, his eyes darting to mine. "What's your problem this time?" "My problem?" I snapped. "My problem is that your ex-girlfriend just came to my door to warn me that you've angered some very dangerous people." His expression darkened, and for a moment I thought he might try to deny it. Instead, he sighed and dropped his bag onto the floor. "Harper shouldn't have gotten involved." Shouldn't have had to," I retorted. "What the hell are you doing, Mason? Do you even understand the position you've put me in?" "It's not as bad as she's making it sound," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Not as bad?" I repeated, incredulous. "She said they'll come after me if you don't pay them back. What part of that isn't bad?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I'm handling it, okay? I just need more time." "You don't have time," I shouted. "You're out of here by the end of the week. No excuses. If you're not gone, I'll call the police." His head snapped up and he glared at me. "You'd really call the cops on your own brother?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "If it means protecting myself, absolutely. You've crossed every line, Mason. I'm done cleaning up your messes." For a moment he just stared at me, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. Then, without another word, he grabbed his bag and stormed into the spare room, slamming the door shut behind him. I stood there, shaking, unsure if I'd just made things better or worse. The next day I called Ella to update her. "He still doesn't get it," I said, pacing the living room. "I gave him until the end of the week, but I don't think he'll actually leave." "You've done the right thing," she replied firmly. "You can't let him pull you into his problems. If he doesn't leave, you'll have to follow through." "I know," I muttered. "I just didn't think it would come to this." There was a pause before she spoke again. Ryan, there's something else you should know. I heard from Noah last night. He saw Mason downtown. What happened? I asked, my stomach sinking. It said Mason was talking to some shady-looking guys. They looked tense, like they were arguing. I groaned, pinching the bridge of my nose. Great. Just what I needed to hear. Be careful, she warned. If these guys know where you live, you need to protect yourself. I will, I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure how. That evening, I decided to confront Mason one last time. If he wasn't gone by the end of the week, I'd have no choice but to involve the authorities. I knocked on his door and waited, but there was no response. Mason, I called. Open up. Still nothing. Frowning, I pushed the door open and found the room empty. His bag was gone, along with most of his clothes. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd finally come to his senses and left. But then I noticed a small pile of envelopes on the desk. One had been opened, its contents spread out in plain view. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. What I saw made my stomach drop. Inside the envelope was a short, handwritten note. Your time's up. Pay what you owe, or we'll make you pay another way. Beneath it was a photo of my apartment building. My knees went weak as the gravity of the situation sank in. They weren't just coming for Mason. They were coming here. My hands trembled as I carefully replaced the note and backed out of the room. I needed a plan, and fast. I called Ella again, my voice shaking. They know where I live. I found a picture of my building and Mason's stuff. Oh my God, she whispered. Ryan, you need to get out of there. I can't just leave, I argued. This is my home. But it's not safe, she insisted. What if they show up? Her fear was infectious, and I found myself pacing again, my mind racing. Maybe I should call the police. Do it, she urged. This isn't just about Mason anymore. It's about your safety. I hesitated, torn. Calling the police felt like a last resort, but what choice did I have? If these people came looking for Mason, they wouldn't care that I wasn't involved. Before I could decide, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, staring at it like it might explode. Ryan? Ella's voice came through the phone, faint but worried. What's happening? There's someone at the door, I whispered, creeping toward it. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize. A rough-looking guy with a shaved head, tattoos, and a scowl that could curdle milk. I think it's one of them, I whispered, backing away. Don't open it, Ella said urgently. Call the police. Before I could grab my phone, the man knocked again, harder this time. Hey, Mason, he barked. I know you're in there. Open up. I held my breath, praying he'd leave. Instead, he'd tried the doorknob. When it didn't budge, he cursed under his breath and started pounding on the door. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the knob, my hands shaking. He thinks Mason's here, I whispered into the phone. Ryan, call the cops now, Ella urged. Just as I reached for my phone, the pounding stopped. I listened, heart racing, as the man muttered something to himself and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before finally exhaling. That was too close, Ella said, her voice shaky. Promise me you'll call the police. I will, I said, though the idea still felt like surrender. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every noise made me jump, every shadow felt threatening. Mason was nowhere to be found, and I wasn't sure if he'd even come back. Part of me hoped you wouldn't. At least then I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But as I sat in the dark, clutching my phone like a lifeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next morning, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Still groggy from a restless night, I grabbed it and saw a string of messages from Mason. "We need to talk. I messed up. Please don't call the cops. I'll explain everything. Meet me at Dad's house." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. After everything he'd done, now he wanted to talk? A part of me wanted to talk. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but another part, the part that hated unfinished business, knew I needed answers. When I arrived at my parents' house, Mason was already there, pacing the living room like a caged animal. My mom sat on the couch wringing her hands, while my dad stood off to the side, arms crossed and his expression steely. The tension in the room was suffocating. "What's this about?" I asked, my tone icy as I stepped inside. Mason looked up, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, he seemed genuinely shaken. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely audible. I let out a bitter laugh. "Help? After everything you've done, you have the nerve to ask me for help?" "Ryan, please," my mom said, her voice pleading. "He's scared." "Good," I snapped. "He should be." "Ryan, that's enough," my dad barked, his tone sharp. "Let him speak." I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall and glaring at Mason. "Fine. Talk." He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling. "I owe these guys money. More than I ever thought I'd have to pay back. It started small, a few bets here and there. But then I kept losing. I started borrowing to cover it, and before I knew it, I was in over my head." "How much do you owe?" I asked flatly. 20 grand, he whispered. The room fell silent. My mom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. My dad's expression darkened, and I could feel the anger radiating off him. 20 grand, I repeated, shaking my head, and your brilliant solution was to hide out in my apartment and drag me into your mess? I didn't mean for it to get this far, Mason said, his voice cracking. I thought I could fix it before it got bad, but now they're threatening me. They said, if I don't pay, they'll come after me, and anyone close to me. You mean me, I said bitterly. They've already come to my apartment, Mason. Do you have any idea what that was like? I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted you to be involved. Then why didn't you leave when I told you to? I snapped. You've had weeks to sort this out, but instead you've been sitting on my couch playing video games like none of this matters. Because I didn't know what else to do, he shouted, desperation in his voice. I'm scared, Ryan. I don't know how to fix this. You don't fix this by dragging your family down with you, my dad said, his tone harsh. You fix it by owning up to your mistakes and facing the consequences. Mason looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. Dad, they're not the kind of people you can just face. They'll kill me. I swallowed hard, his words hitting me like a punch. As much as I despised what Mason had done, the thought of him being in real danger churned my stomach. But I couldn't keep letting him risk my safety. Then you need to leave, I said firmly. Get out of the city, go somewhere they can't find you. I can't just run, he said, his voice trembling. They'll track me down. Then what do you want from me, Mason? I demanded. You got yourself into this mess. I'm not putting my life on the line to bail you out. He opened his mouth to respond, but my dad cut him off. Ryan's right. You need to deal with this yourself. We've done enough to help you, and all you've done is make things worse. Mason's shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the floor, defeated. For the first time, it seemed like he truly understood how badly he had messed up. That night I returned to my apartment, my nerves still frayed. Mason had promised to pack his things and leave by the end of the week, but I wasn't counting on it. He always managed to worm his way out of his promises. Still, the thought of finally reclaiming my space gave me a glimmer of hope. That hope didn't last. Around midnight, I woke to a loud crash outside my door. My heart racing, I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door. Peering through the peephole, my blood ran cold. 2 men stood outside, one pounding on the door, the other holding a baseball bat. "Mason," the first man shouted, "we know you're in there. Open up or we're coming in." Backing away, my hands shaking. I realized Mason wasn't even here. But they didn't know that. If they broke in, I'd be the one to face their wrath. I quickly dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity as the men continued shouting and banging on the door. "Come on, Mason," one of them yelled. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Finally, the distant sound of sirens reached my ears. The men must have heard it too because they cursed and fled. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher until the police arrived, my hands still shaking as I let them in. After explaining everything, the officers assured me they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for the men. But even after they left, the fear lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling they'd come back. The next morning, I called my landlord and explained the situation. To my surprise, he was understanding and agreed to let me break my lease early. I spent the day packing, determined to leave the apartment, and all the chaos Mason had brought behind. Ella came over to help. Her presence was a reminder that not everyone in my life caused stress. "You're doing the right thing," she said as we loaded boxes into my car. "You deserve to feel safe." "I just wish it didn't have to end like this," I said, glancing back at the building that had once felt like home. "It's not your fault," she said firmly. "Mason made his choices, and now he has to face the consequences." As I drove away, a storm of emotions swirled inside me, relief, sadness, and anger all at once. I didn't know what the future held for Mason, but one thing was clear. I was done letting him control my life. It was time to move forward and reclaim my space, both physically and emotionally.